Dog world, but in this case, we're talking about snakes. Dozens of snakes were released into the wild in North Florida to eat other invasive snakes.
Florida has an issue with slithering. For many years, Burmese pythons have been the dominant species. The Everglades, consuming everything from rabbits to adult alligators. Traps, hunters, and bounties barely made a difference. Consequently, the bold and possibly unsettling choice to try anything was made by scientists. They provided something that would destroy the snakes from the inside out. It was successful at first, but what happened next left everyone in disbelief. Now let's look at how it all began. The slithering nightmare of Florida, the invasion begins. If you've ever strolled through the mysterious, sun-drenched Everglades, Florida's wild interior, you might have felt like someone was watching you. Not a gator, not a bird, but something longer, heavier, and oddly silent. The Burmese python. Once a staple in the pet trade, this snake wasn't meant to be there. But decades ago, a few escaped or were released by overworked owners. Unexpectedly became the world's most dangerous reptile in the Everglades. At first, nobody was very intrigued. There has never been an empty Everglades of unusual creatures such as giant eagles, crocodiles, and panthers. But toward the end of the 1990s, rangers started to notice strange things, such missing raccoons, fewer rabbits, and disappearing deer. The bobcats also seemed to be going extinct. Not until scientists began examining large pythons, they realized horribly that these animals were eating everything. The entire ecosystems were falling apart from the inside out, just like the prey in their stomachs. The pythons were also spreading swiftly. A single female can lay up to 100 eggs at once. In the lack of natural predators, they also slithered through wetlands, canals, and residential areas. Locals often found 15-foot snakes relaxing in their backyards, or driving as though they were the owners of the land. Florida did everything it could. Hunters were compensated for find them. Drone cameras were used to study the wetlands. Even competitions to hunt pythons emerged, drawing bold locals and out-of-state adventurers armed with machetes and self-assurance. But no matter how many were captured, more kept showing up. It was comparable to trying to empty a sinking boat with a spoon. What's the truth? These snakes weren't. Instead of just getting by, they were thriving. Their massive size and voracious appetites made in their new home, they were virtually unbeatable. Some have even begun engaging in sexual activity with various snake species, creating hybrids that were harder to spot, faster, and more robust. Florida's, the natural wildlife, had no chance. Therefore, what should you do if a species invades? Assumes command of an entire ecosystem? You defend yourselves with science. In the latter half of the 20th century, researchers and wildlife officials modified their approach. Instead of going after each python separately, they began looking into anything that would aim for them from within. Consider it something that might proliferate like a Trojan horse. Eliminate the snake population covertly without jeopardizing the ecosystem overall. Rumor had claimed that they were experimenting with genetic tools, potentially viruses, bacteria, or even a lab-created pathogen that would only hurt pythons. Others whispered about pheromone traps and hormone disruptors designed to interrupt their cycles of reproduction. It sounded like science fiction, but Florida's python problem had become so severe that almost anything was being thought of. Teams of ecologists, geneticists, and biologists began working behind closed doors to what they called biocontrol solutions. Their goal was to figure out how to produce the pythons, stop reproducing, or simply go extinct on their own without firing a single shot. If it was effective, it might change wildlife management forever. But playing with nature is never simple, especially when the target is a predator that has been around for millions of years. The preliminary tests were conducted in isolated, controlled wetlands and were kept secret. Conditions. The locals were just aware that something was being tested there. Additionally, when word got out that a biological weapon of some kind would be used, the rumors got out of control. But officials remained calm. For them, this was the natural next step. In the end, traditional methods had failed miserably. There was a risk of ecological collapse in the Everglades. Collapse and action was the only option. Something needs to change right away. In the end, what did they release and how did it end pythons from the inside out? Florida scientists revealed nature's secret assassin. Wasn't a monster when he went into the Everglades, at least not in the traditional sense. It didn't slither or hiss, or go on strike. It was small, undetectable to the unaided eye, and designed to carry out tasks that no human could. Decrease the quantity of internal pythons. It started out as a whisper among scientists, a biological control agent, a naturally occurring bacterium found in the guts of certain snakes. Asia is where Burmese pythons first appeared. In their country of origin, this bacteria managed their populace. It didn't kill them entirely, but it did weaken them and disrupt their digestive systems and reproductive organs with time. When Florida researchers discovered this, they felt an opportunity. Maybe nature had already created the required weapon. Through years of testing in labs and containment facilities, they tried to understand the bacteria's secrets. They adjusted it, looked into its spread, and ensured that it wouldn't put native species in danger. They had a very clear objective. They were exclusively going to target Burmese pythons. Nothing more. The science was. It's interesting to note that the bacteria could live in the water without harming anyone, but they would become active when they came into touch with the python's body. It would progressively impede the snake's ability to process food, which would ultimately result in. It was wonderful. Even when it was full, it starved from the inside. Actually, it was risky. Nature does not always follow human plans. Following the release of a tiny item, once you're in an open atmosphere, there's no turning back. But urgency overcame skepticism. The project, under environmental control, AIMS, Operation Coilbreaker, was covertly authorized. At first, it seemed to work perfectly. Within a few weeks, captured snakes in monitoring areas showed signs of severe weakness. They slowed down and lost their appetite. There, once shiny scales turned matte and lifeless. Wildlife rangers made the discovery of python carcasses in the marshes far away, with no signs of violence or injuries, just lifeless coils of. They had large, muscular stomachs that were eerily empty. For the first time in a long time, the local wildlife. The figures began to plateau. Again, marsh bunnies were seen. The wading birds returned to constructing their nests, areas that had been silent for a decade. It appeared to be a miracle. Local media began to commemorate. The mystery cure was saving the Everglades, but experts said nothing. They knew what the real test was what transpired subsequently, not if it was successful. You see, nature never operates in a vacuum. Each soil grain, predator, and bacterium is a part of a chain reaction. Additionally, when one element occurs, all else is altered. Soon, strange rumors began to surface from deep within the wetlands. Small reptiles, including native snakes and even frogs, were exhibiting unusual behavior. Some began avoiding particular bodies of water. Others were mysteriously dying. At first, the researchers wrote it off as a coincidence, possibly brought on by exposure or variations in temperature. To break down python carcasses, the microbe they had produced was the worst aspect, though. Didn't just pursue pythons. It was no longer the same. It began adapting to other large reptiles, including invasive monitor lizards and a few alligators. In the midst of the wild, the tiny weapon was changing faster than expected in an unstable environment. Information about the group, Victory, turned to fear in the logs. The precise weapon they had created to protect the Everglades was endangering the food chain. Officials were hesitant to declare anything, though. Anything. Public panic will be disastrous. Instead, they pulled out field teams and began collecting samples. They swiftly developed an antidote in the background, a biological off switch, but it wasn't easy. The bacteria had already gone too widely. Despite Florida's victory over the pythons, the battle was far from over. A confrontation with something far worse? What really happened when the bacteria began to alter making experts question whether nature was taking revenge. When nature initially resisted, no one wanted to accept it. After all, Operation Coilbreaker was hailed as one of the most inventive methods of managing wildlife. Efforts in the modern era. Scientists had found a way to fight nature with nature, a clean, eco-friendly solution to a horrible problem. But the Everglades had a different perspective. When field researchers returned a few weeks later, the marsh had transformed. The air's thickness, quieter. The normally lively river had moments of eerie quiet. Along with carcasses of pythons, rangers also found fish belly up and turtles that refused to enter particular rivers, and local snakes behaving strangely by curling in peculiar ways. Rounds of shaking before dying. The bacterium had transformed and was no longer recognizable. The biosphere appears to have erupted in fury. Samples taken from the affected regions showed how the germs had developed to survive outside of the python's body, instead of becoming extinct. After its host died, it survived in the warm, nutrient-rich marsh water. Following that, it began to spread to other creatures. Some struggled, while others gave up almost instantly. The marshes that had sustained life for thousands of years were suddenly turning into silent, sterile pools of desolation. The labs were immediately filled with fear. The organism that the scientists had meticulously contained transformed into something unexpected. Modification besides the Everglades. Soon, the germs appeared in linked streams that stretched southward. Florida shores. Boaters observed unusual slicks on the water's surface, like a shimmering, odorless oil. In one horrifying case, a dead python washed up near a house. Canal, with a portion of its skin peeling off the inside, and the weapon kept working. In an effort to contain it, Florida authorities walled off huge wetlands and emergency task forces employed chemical neutralizers to get access to affected regions by watercraft. However, the operation's general secrecy has drawn criticism from environmentalists. That final approval for the study was still pending, that the bacteria's release had been. Under pressure to provide results fast, the story went viral across the nation in a matter of days, making headlines. Yelled, "Python plague threatens wetlands," along with Florida's bioweapon backfires. Nevertheless, despite the belief held by some that the bacteria could infect humans, scientists immediately contested it, with some claiming that it was a government cover-up, citing mysterious conspiracy theories spread online, and military trucks were spotted near the testing sites. Behind the chaos, the scientific world split into two factions, one of which argued that the bacteria was undergoing mutation due to extreme heat, pollution, and other unforeseen environmental factors, or coming into contact with rotting animal stuff. The other suggested something even more unsettling, that by seriously disrupting the natural equilibrium, they had triggered an evolutionary chain reaction. In other words, the Everglades were getting better. The bacteria's evolution stopped after a few months, relocating to specific wetland areas. The direct threat to wildlife began to diminish. But the damage was already done. It would take years for the ecosystem to recover, and the python problem, strangely, it wasn't even completely resolved. A few hardy snakes had survived, and their bodies, exhibiting a level of resistance to germs. Although they were weaker, they were still alive and carried modified strains of the living time bomb-like microbes in their guts. But what happened to the handful that survived? Pythons that made it through the test. The response shocked even the most seasoned. The survivors, herpetologists. The first Burmese pythons to survive were found by researchers months after the release. The microbes were silent, slow, and meant to kill them, so they thought it was a mistake. And yet here they were, huge and breathing, drifting across the dark seas of the Everglades as like nothing had happened. Yet a closer look revealed something amazing. The remaining snakes had internal scars and were no longer typical. Their scales were patchier and rougher, and some of them even developed an odd metallic sheen when exposed to the sun. When they were dissected, it was found that their internal organs had changed shape their stomach linings were thicker, their hyperactive immune systems. These pythons have been able to stave off the infection's effects and emerge in a new manner, stronger than before, and scientists identified them as. Evolution was happening in real time, and it was more than just survival. Genetic testing confirmed that the snakes had undergone a mutation. Their immune systems were able to recognize and eliminate the germs before they could proliferate. This was an uncommon large-scale, complex adaptation in just 1 or 2 generations. Usually, evolution takes thousands of years. However, due to extreme biological pressure, the Burmese python's genetic code has been changed. In one shocking field study, a team found a huge female python, over 17 feet long, carried the unique mutation. She was found with a whole new generation of bacteria-resistant pythons was produced as a result of all 96 eggs being viable, was already beginning to take shape, and they would not just survive but reign. Scientists were both concerned and motivated by this. Originally a weapon, the bacteria has become a training ground for evolution. Instead of eradicating the species, scientists had inadvertently accelerated its adaptation, and Florida now faced an even more formidable challenge. A super python that is resistant to the biocontrol agents meant to stop it, as well as predators. Meanwhile, wildlife rangers began to notice odd activity. The most recent pythons of this generation seemed more bold, agile, and even approachable. Suburban areas. One python was observed wrapped up behind a backyard pool filter in Naples. Another crept across a parking lot in Homestead. They were no longer just concealing. Ecologists warned that they were going into unknown territory. It is possible for mutated snakes to relocate outside of the Everglades. In the southern United States, according to certain calculations, they may even survive as far north as the Carolinas if temperature increases brought on by climate change continued. The Florida Wildlife Commission quickly launched Phase 2 with the intention of tracking and monitoring the remaining population. Using radio tags and drones with infrared sensors, they began mapping the new python strongholds, and what they found confirmed their worst assumptions. Compared to earlier times, the bacteria-resistant snakes were reproducing faster and spreading farther. Strangely enough, Operation Coilbreaker had failed to halt the invasion, but altered it, turning what had started out as a desperate attempt to control nature into a live experiment in rapid adaptation, which is presently being studied by specialists all over the world as a warning on what happens when people interfere with ecosystems they don't fully understand. Even worse, the bacterium was still present in the systems of these snakes. In addition to being bearers of resistance, they hosted a living legacy and passed it on to others. It seemed as though nature had taken humanity's attack and turned it into armor for their offspring. The Everglades had permanently changed, yet in the final report, one expert famously said, "The pythons were not killed by us. We taught them survival techniques." Are you saying that they are unstoppable? The greatest turn of events. When scientists realized they couldn't outsmart the pythons above ground, they decided to look. In reality, beneath the Everglades is a vast limestone network that resembles a secret maze. Caverns, water tunnels, and underground rivers were formed over thousands of years. These places were mostly ignored since they were believed to be too shallow or unstable to support much life. But once the germs were discharged, strange readings began to show up on environmental. There was movement down there, sensors buried in the ground. At first, scientists believed that it might simply be groundwater flowing or shifting. Fish, but the signals were too large to be continuous, rhythmic, or random. One of the most daring wildlife studies ever was carried out by Florida's Environmental Research. The group sent remotely operated underwater drones into the caverns underneath the swamp. They were shocked to find dozens of massive living pythons below ground. Since the beginning of the bacterial outbreak, groups of snakes have somehow infiltrated these places. They chased catfish in the dark, creating a secret survival environment amid flooded tunnels. Eels and small alligators ensnared in the tunnels, the bacteria that had earlier decimated. These underground snakes actually appeared to be unfazed by their kind down here. They looked healthier, bigger, more muscular, and more coordinated than their relatives who lived on the surface. It seems like evolution had given them an entirely new home to conquer. Cameras captured disturbing footage of their motions, revealing numerous people writhing in the water. Their scales shimmer like liquid metal when exposed to infrared light. According to a video that was later made public, showed a python consuming another python, indicating that the species was now becoming cannibalistic. Perhaps as a result of environmental pressure, scientists began to think that this behavior was an extra adaptation, a way to recycle nutrients and strengthen protection against the bacteria that remain in surface waters. What's even more alarming is that samples from the subterranean pools contained traces of the same strain of bacteria that had evolved. It appeared to have been transported into the caverns by the pythons during Operation Coilbreaker, where the bacteria continued to develop independently, the shadows. The ideal petri dish for further development had been created in the oxygen-poor environment below. Underneath, what had begun as an experiment to eradicate marsh bugs had become a biological time bomb. There were other species in the underworld than snakes, according to research. New microbial species are consuming the bacterial remnants, creating an unusual and self-contained microscopic habitat. Snake tissue can be rapidly rebuilt and metabolized by specific microbes, suggesting a whole new field of biological chemistry. It was like finding alive. This scientific experiment has been built by nature on top of human error. The public's indignation exploded as video snippets surfaced on social media. Hashtags. There were numerous conspiracy theories and prominent hashtags like #SwampBelow and #PythonPit for weeks, with some claiming the government had set up an entire subterranean breeding facility to hide the fallout from Operation Coilbreaker. Officials denied everything, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own, but scientists were less concerned, more worried about public perception and confinement. Should these snakes ever emerge from the subterranean network in large quantities, Florida might be vulnerable to a second invasion. The Everglades have never been deserted, making it exceedingly harder to locate or halt. Of mysteries, but this was unheard of, a whole hidden world thriving beneath the surface, produced by human activity as well as nature's unrelenting urge to exist. Thank you for reading. Please click subscribe and leave a comment below for more posts like this one.